Well, here we are at long last. The 2022 season is done. I've given you my thoughts on qualifying linked above, but now it's time to rank all 20 drivers most impressive to least impressive. I've also polled you lot, so we've got yours going simultaneously to mine. So let's see where all 20 drivers place in my 2022 driver rankings. After 11 races this year, I did my mid-season report. We'll also be referencing back to them to see which drivers have improved relative in terms of my opinion and your opinion and gone backwards. Now, for every single race this season, I've done a pre and post-race stream. And in the post-race stream, I always divvy out a driver W, driver L. Dubs and Ls for the teams as well. Let's quickly reflect on that before we get into the full list. 7 driver W of the weekends for Max Verstappen. 7 Ls for Latifi. No big surprises there. 11 Red Bull dubs, 6 Ferrari Ls. No big surprises in the top numbers. Gasly, Tsunoda actually. Look at between the AlphaTauri boys, they got as many Ls of the weekend as Latifi got on his own. Sergio Perez also managing a lot of dubs of the weekend. Nick De Vries, honourable mention. I'm not going to mention him in the 20. I'm not doing the 22 because he only filled in for one race. But fair play, Nick. We of course have to start at the back with good old Nicholas Latifi. Sorry, Nicky, but in my opinion, and in your opinion, with a score of 2.4 out of 10 and no position change from midfield, P20 mid-season, P20 today. It feels like the admittedly small amount of moments we've had from Nicholas that have been half decent have all come in tricky weather conditions, whether it's Suzuka this year, P12 when it rained at Silverstone this year, qualifying Belgium last year. But those moments didn't come anywhere near enough and he's out of the sport. Nicholas Latifi, this is probably the last time I ever talk about you on this channel. Best of luck, maybe an IndyCar seat, NASCAR, who knows. P19, another one that shouldn't really surprise too much. I've gone with Daniel Ricciardo moving down one place from my mid-season rankings from P18 to P19. And you've also picked Daniel with an average score of 3.4 out of 10. Look, Daniel had his moments. Singapore P5, Mexico P7, great drive there as well. But nowhere near enough. And when you look at his teammates' results, the delta, you just can't look past it. For a driver of his experience, his calibre, it simply wasn't good enough. I hope he understands why. That if he does get an opportunity back in a Formula 1 car, which, you know, is returned to Red Bull as a reserve, then I hope this doesn't happen again. I hope we see him back on track. I honestly really do. But he's also got to make any prospective team confident that they're not going to get a McLaren Ricciardo, they're going to get a Renault or Red Bull Ricciardo. P18, another driver who's leaving the sport at the end of the year. I kind of went to and fro a little bit on this one, but I think Mick Schumacher, P18, going down from P16, I put in mid-season. And look, a combination of the shunts, and Brazil was that opportunity that Kev took and Mick was completely unable to seize it. When you're in a team that's struggling at the bottom end of the midfield, you need drivers who, when an opportunity presents itself, can take it. You know, he had a great Silverstone race, he had a great Austria race. Austria was the peak for Mick Schumacher this year, by far and away his best performance. Comfortably outperformed Kevin Magnussen that weekend. You can't have 1 or 2 races out of 22 where it's really good and the rest are either bad or just straight up mediocre. Not for a team like Haas anyway. They were his only 2-point scores of the season and he only got 1 P11. And as for you lot, you've also put Mick Schumacher with a score of 4.7 out of 10 average, down from P14 to P18. Now, I didn't look at your ranking until I finished mine because I didn't want to be subconsciously swayed. Because at the end of the day, with 5,782 of you who did the poll, I like to think that that number as a collective comes out with a pretty accurate representation. So it's a challenge for me to see how close I get to yours, because ultimately yours should be the most objective on average. But we all have our preferences, all have our biases, all have our own perspectives. Because from now on, our picks start to deviate a little bit. P17, and these are a glug of drivers, you could argue put it in any order, right? But for me, I've gone with Yuki Tsunoda, which might surprise you if you watch my qualifying video. Whereas your pick with 4.8 out of 10 is Lance Stroll. Now, why have I put Yuki so low? Look, at the end of the day, yes, his qualifying performances did significantly improve relative to Pierre Gasly, but Pierre was the driver bringing the points home more often than not. I just find Yuki a really frustrating driver to watch because, again, I believe that rough diamond is still there. And I think he's shown enough this year to merit a 3rd season. But if he was at a team like Haas that's set up similarly to Haas and isn't supported by a big energy drink company, right, I think Yuki probably would have lost his seat just like Mick did. They've had quite similar seasons all in all. Pace not necessarily the problem, but some big, stupid mistakes. Silverstone taking out Pierre Canada driving into the wall, for example. If Yuki doesn't beat Nick De Vries at AlphaTauri next year, that's his time done. I think he's got 3 years, like Giovinazzi did, 3 years to really show it. He hasn't quite yet. Giovinazzi never really was able to shine. I really hope Yuki can next year. On to P16, and I have gone with Lance Stroll this time. You lot, with 5.1 out of 10, you went for Pierre Gasly. So Lance does jump up from P19 to P16 from my mid-season ratings. Again, another frustrating driver. Yes, he almost wiped out Sebastian Vettel and Fernando Alonso in successive races. Yes, he locked up his tyres in Baku, didn't have the forethought to maybe not push too hard and ended up bearing it into the wall in qualifying. Lazily swerved into Nicholas Latifi in Australia, writing both cars off. He's had his stupid moment. But as you saw in my qualifying video, his gap to Sebastian, particularly in qualifying, in the second half of the season, he literally closed the gap completely. And when he wasn't punting people off, he was actually really consistent in a car that hasn't been very good, especially at the start of the season. I'd argue 6th best car by the end of the season, but at the start, 9th, easy. 2-point scoring finishes to see out the season. Great job in Singapore, putting it P6 in tricky conditions. He finished P10 6 times this season. I actually draw parallels in this to the Alpine boys. I think, Vettel and Alonso have definitely outperformed their teammates, but also not got as lucky as their teammates. And then Stroll and Ocon have got luckier, but it doesn't mean they've done a really bad job. I mean, Stroll has done a very bad job on occasion, but generally speaking, when he keeps it clean, Stroll has actually been pretty good. And obviously, Vettel and Alonso have much bigger, more passionate fan bases. I think it's fair to say that Ocon and Stroll are 2 of the least popular drivers on the grid. So that's how our lists are sitting currently. My rankings versus yours. Now, on to P15. It's the AlphaTauri boys back again. For me, I've gone Pierre Gasly, P15, and you've gone for Yuki Tsunoda. With a 5.4 out of 10, with both drivers improving from where we put them at mid-season. Now, again, in my qualifying video, I talked about how I was more impressed with Yuki in qualifying than I was with Pierre. But ultimately, Pierre is more complete, is more able to get those points in those races. Is typically finishing ahead of Yuki, even if he's not necessarily starting ahead of Yuki. Pierre set very, very high expectations in 2021. I was fully on board the Pierre gas train, 100%. But this season, I've given him L of the weekend 4 times. Took himself and Lando out in Miami, consistently slower than Yuki in Spain, caught a couple of shunts in the Austria sprint and main race, plus had a shocker in Suzuka qualifying. It's a shame that Pierre's time in Faenza ended with P9 in the Constructors, because again, you expect that lead driver to carry, and I just don't think Pierre carried enough. They should have finished ahead of Haas 100%. P14, I've gone with the rookie, Zhou Guanyu. No change for me, P14 mid-season, P14 now. You lot, wow, big drop for Valtteri Bottas going from P7 to P14. That's pretty mad. 6.4 out of 10. Although, again, keep an eye on those numbers because these gaps are starting to get pretty marginal. Look, like I said in qualifying, I put Zhou ahead of Bottas. From a qualifying point of view, I was more impressed with Zhou. But for me to put Zhou ahead of Valtteri in the overall ranking would be to completely ignore what Valtteri did at the start of the season. How impressive he was. How he got, 7 point scoring finishes in his first 9 races. Zhou set a fantastic foundation. He's quietened all of the chat around pay driver that, I'll be honest, I was part of, because you look at his F2 career and he didn't shine like we've seen other drivers shine, but he's jumped into Formula 1 and he's more than proved that he deserves time. He did better than any of the other rookies last year for sure. Because then in P13, I've put Valtteri and you've put Zhou, also with 6.4 out of 10, but Zhou scored slightly higher with you guys than he did with me. Everything I said about Zhou was praising him, and Valtteri had a fantastic start to the season, but again, as you saw in my qualifying video, second half of the season, that average qualifying gap was less than a tenth in Valtteri's favour. Now, a driver of his experience, coming from Mercedes, having raced against Lewis Hamilton, I would expect him to do a bigger demolition job on Zhou Guanyu. Question is, how much of that is Valtteri underperforming or Zhou overperforming? I don't know. I'm trying not to be too recency biased because he was so good at the start of the year. And clearly that Alfa Romeo package, not only was it breaking down a lot towards the mid and end of the season, but the performance just was not there anymore. And that's not on the drivers really, is it? P12, and with a score of 6.5 out of 10, we have both gone, we agree on this one, with Kevin Magnussen. One position up from where I put him in the middle of the season, and 3 positions down from where you lot did. Like I said when I was talking about Mick, Brazil, he capitalised on that opportunity. Bahrain, first race of the season, Kev capitalised on that opportunity when that car was good, which it was at the start of the year. The Haas and the Alfa Romeo were strong at the start of the year. That's when you needed to secure the bag. And Mick wasn't able to do that anywhere near as much as Kevin was. He's an experienced F1 driver. Yes, he had a year out, but coming into these new regulation cars for this season was a fresh sheet of paper for everyone. So it was the best time to come in. I'm a sucker for a compelling narrative, and Kevin Magnussen's return to then put it on pole in Brazil is just fills my heart, man. It fills my heart. And then in P11, interesting one this, I've gone with Alex Albon from P12 to P11. You've gone with 6.6 out of 10 with Esteban Ocon down from P10 in the mid-season ratings. Now, of course, credit to Alex for doing an absolute demolition job on his teammate. His average gap to teammate is bigger than any other average gap across the field, right? Obviously, Latifi isn't the benchmark, is he? But this is why it's difficult, because, if Leclerc was teammates with Latifi, do I think he would be out-qualifying Latifi by more? I do. But then how much more? That average gap of over 0.6 of a second, should it be 1 second? Or actually, is it about right? But regardless, that Williams clearly struggled in the races, was clearly the worst car over the course of the season in totality. Obviously not in Monza, but all cars have specific tracks where they excel more than others. I mean, Alex got in the top 12 8 times this year. So 8 times he got really close to the points. And he still got 5 P13s as well. It only takes a couple of DNFs up top, a couple of, twats battling for the lead. Boom, you're in the points, you know what I mean? Those are the best numbers I felt you could expect for Alex to deliver. But where there's so much uncertainty around teammate, I can't in earnest put him higher than this. So we're halfway through. How are your rankings looking? I mean, look, the numbers are pretty close. Between Bottas and Ocon is like 0.2. So there's very marginal votes in it. Obviously, there were a few troll votes, inevitably. But I've just left them all in because I like to think it all kind of balances each other out, really. All right, top 10 time. Now, this one I thought was pretty contentious. But turns out you've gone for the exact same person. In P10, I've gone Sergio Perez, and so have you. 6.9 out of 10. For me, he's gone from P5 to P10. From you, he's gone from P4 to P10 from the mid-season report. So a big shift down from Checo. Look, at the end of the day, that quali gap to Max has grown. It's almost half a second. Only 2 wins all season when your teammate gets 15. Only 5 podiums in the last 11 races as well. Yes, he's been picking up the pieces a lot of the time when it's been called of him. And yes, he's doing a better job than Pierre and Alex in that Red Bull, no question. However, if he wants to keep hold of that Red Bull seat, he's going to need to close that gap, because Mercedes and Ferrari aren't going to be as far off forever. And if you watch my qualifying video, you'll see how close the gaps are between George and Lewis, how close it is between Charles and Carlos as well. If Sergio can't get closer to Max, then that's going to potentially stint both Red Bull and Max Verstappen's chances of future championships. So then in P9, I've gone with Esteban Ocon. You've gone with Alex Albon. It's like all this prop, I don't even need to be biased for Albon anymore. You're doing it for me. Yes, I've succeeded in corrupting you all. Love it. He also got 6.9 out of 10, slightly more than Checo, so slightly higher, not by much. But yeah, look, I've gone Esteban. He's moved from P11 to P9 in my standings. Look, the fact that Fernando's been doing so well and has been so unlucky, I think has made the consensus around Ocon that, he's just got lucky this year. But I don't think that's fair. The qualifying gap, especially in the second half of the season, isn't much. It's like a tenth and a half. And the race gap, yeah, sure. I think Fernando has done a better job than Esteban. But also, I rate Fernando so highly. He's clearly still at insane levels. So most people would be getting beaten by Fernando. Bad luck all you like. Esteban outscored Fernando. He is the closest driver who didn't get a podium this year to getting one with his P4 finish in Japan. And his reliability card hasn't been completely clean either. He's been on the receiving end of Alpine DNFs and dodgy qualifying sessions because of the car playing up. Again, not to the extent of Fernando, but that doesn't mean Esteban hasn't also done a good job. I'm fascinated to see how they do toe-to-toe, him and Pierre next year at Alpine. I can't call it. I really can't, because I rate them both very highly. In P8, I have gone with Sebastian Vettel. You have gone with Carlos Sainz, 7.1 out of 10. Vettel moves from P9 to P8 in my standings. Look, I think his first half of the season was pretty underrated. Yes, he had a missed first couple of races with COVID. Then he had the spin in Australia, which was a big L, no doubt. But especially since that Aston Martin has started improving, he's been the one wringing the neck out of it. I mean, Vettel should have quite a few more points on the board, especially if it wasn't for Mick taking him out of Miami, which was very awkward. Now, he hasn't been incredible relative to Stroll in qualifying, which is kind of holding him back a bit. But ultimately, yeah, in the races, he's done bits. I think the team have actually let him down quite a number of times this season in terms of strategy. I mean, even most recently. Happy to see him ending his career on a high. And then we go to P7, and it's reverse. You lot picked Seb. I picked Carlos Sainz. I'm sorry, how did you lot give Seb P15 in the mid-season report? I still can't get over that. Yeah, Seb scored 7.2. Carlos has moved from P10 to P7. Look, I've been impressed with how Carlos has seemingly been able to close that gap to Charles in the second half of the season. Has he got many podiums to his name? Has he been outperforming Charles on a Sunday? Not really. But I think also that's coincided with the Mercedes getting quicker and taking opportunities for Carlos to get on the pole. Because look, Mercedes has looked like a quicker race car in the last few races. Without his 4 first lap DNFs, he'd be in a much better place. And sure, some have been his fault. Australia, for example, definitely his fault. But some haven't, like Austin, when George took him out. Definitely points on the table for Carlos Sainz, but ultimately I think Ferrari will be happy with his performances. And again, when you look at that delta between Verstappen and Perez, the delta between Leclerc and Sainz is much closer. P6. I have gone for Fernando Alonso, moving down from P4, where I put him in the mid-season report. And you lot have gone with 7.5 out of 10, Lewis Hamilton. To be fair, there is very little negative to say about Fernando's season. He's had the odd moment. Driving into the back of Esteban in Brazil was obviously very fresh in the memory, and that was on him. But ultimately, the recovery drive in Austin, unreal. The P2 in qualifying in Canada, unreal. Should have been on the front row, potentially anyway, in Australia if the hydraulics hadn't failed on his car. Fantastic drive through the field in Zandvoort from, P13 to P6. His levels have been immaculate this season, no doubt. If he wasn't for all the bad luck, he would be much closer to Lando, maybe even ahead. This is not the calibre of drive we are used to seeing from a driver in their 40s. Typically, drivers seem to fall off in their sometimes even early 30s. At 41 years of age, Fernando is still going strong and doesn't look like letting up anytime soon. So with 5 left to go, my rankings and your rankings aren't looking all that different. Actually, the biggest discrepancy is Albon, and you've rated him higher than I have. But otherwise, broadly speaking, we're pretty much on the same page. But will that be the case for the last 5? Well, in P5, I have chosen to put Lewis Hamilton. You've gone with Fernando Alonso with an 8 out of 10. And then in P4, I'm going to go straight to that. I've put George Russell. Moving down from the heights of P2 that I gave him at mid-season, you gave it to Charles Leclerc with an 8.2 out of 10. So, Tommo, explain yourself. Why have you put George Russell ahead of Lewis Hamilton? Because I think we can all agree that they've been incredibly close. Again, my qualifying report, you can see their qualifying delta has been poor all season. It's been so small. Look, this is where I stand with Lewis and George in 2022. If you took their names and all context of experience at the team and all that away, right, and it was driver A and driver B, then I would put driver A, being Lewis, higher than I would driver B, George Russell. The fact that he was the test mule at the start of the year, I don't know to what extent that hindered his performances, but my impression is it was significant because by the second half of the season, he was quite comfortably, I felt anyway, quicker than George in race pace particularly. So Lewis slightly edges it on the face of it. However, when you apply the context of this being George's first season at that team and the fact that he delivered the win, a win where Lewis, his teammate, was the one putting the pressure on at the end, George had to hold his nerve and he did, which was incredibly impressive. Now, don't get me wrong, George has jumped down from P2 to P4 for a reason because he's made a bunch of mistakes in this second half of the season. He was the driver responsible mainly for the Joe crash at Silverstone, as far as I'm concerned, putting Sainz out in Austin, Perez in Austria, as well. He got a bit of a reputation from mid-season onwards for being a bit of a shunter. And look, Lewis's year wasn't completely clean either. He was at fault for the tangle with Alonso in Spa, for example. I also think him taking that sausage curb in Abu Dhabi, he didn't have to do that. That was a choice. He should have known it was there. Seemed to damage his car, which retired him from the race in the end. So I do put him responsible for that. I'm just combining everything together. I've been slightly more impressed with George Russell this season than I have been with Lewis Hamilton. So I've got to put him ahead. P3, podium. Right. I've gone with Charles Leclerc again, which ruffled a few feathers mid-season, and he's done it again. Oh, but Tommo, you're just making up controversial ratings because then you get more clicks. You do realise that every single permutation of this top 20 will be controversial to somebody. If I put one driver in one place, then I'll have another driver's fan base have a go at me. If I do it the other way, then the other driver's fan base will have a go. I can't win, so I might as well just be honest. I don't need to lie. But yeah, Charles stays P3 for me. You lot have gone George Russell with an 8.3 out of 10. So who's British bias now? No, look, what could have been for Charles, even if Ferrari hadn't cocked up on strategy multiple times, which they have to take the L on that for sure. Could Charles have really mounted a title challenge, even without his own mistakes as well? Again, Imola, France, stand out. I don't think he would have. I don't think that Ferrari car would have had the pace. I think it would have fizzled out in the second half, kind of like Vettel 2018. But then he has had a bunch of drives that have been super low-key and super impressive. I mean, Brazil putting the wall by Norris to P4. That was a stonkingly incredible drive, and he didn't even get on the podium. I really hope that Charles has learnt what he can from those two kind of quite high profile mistakes. I think with the right strategy team around him and the car that can challenge, I am hopeful that Charles is there 2023. Give him the car and he can take it to max. We know he can take it to max. And I would absolutely love to see Charles win the title in 2023. I just hope he's filled in that final little kind of chink in his armour and is the full package now, because that kid is rapid. And this means I have put Lando No Wins, otherwise known as Lando Norris, P2. And so have you. I mean, you've put British 2 and 3. I can't get over the British bias that's going on right now. Hang on a second. This is my special British bias spray. Well, when it gets a bit too British bias in here, I have to give that... Minus that clumsy collision with Charles in Brazil, all season, what has Lando really done wrong? Because actually now when I reflect, like I put in P7 mid-season, you put in P6, I think we all kind of underestimated him a bit. He's the only driver outside the top 3 teams to get a podium all season. He's only been outside the top 10 5 times all season. All of those instances you can chalk up to that car just having no performance. Bahrain, both cars were nowhere. Miami, Pierre took him out. Canada, Belgium and Brazil were all weekends where that McLaren was struggling for pace throughout. The problem is it's very difficult to compare Lando to the drivers who are fighting for a championship. But when you look at him in isolation, and he's kind of created, and yes, part of this is because Fernando's been very unlucky. I think Fernando would have given him a run for his money if it wasn't for all the bad luck, but you can only deal the card that you dealt. And all this talk of best of the rest that he clearly doesn't like and he clearly finds annoying, I mean, he's best of the rest because he's been doing bits in a car that's been, 5th best car at best. You have to respect his ability to so consistently be at the sharp end of the midfield as well. The midfield is so tight, and especially, again, this McLaren car isn't as competitive as their car last year, for sure. It's easier to trip up in qualifying. He's been sick twice as well. Get some vitamins in yourself, Lando. Go to Holland and Barrett and get a Barocca or something, mate, because Spain and his birthday weekend, Brazil, you're not getting enough nutrients, lad. I've got no issue putting in P2 in this list. He's been incredible, and I really hope McLaren can give him the car to show how good he really is, because we haven't seen it yet. But then in P1, rounding off the list, is the inevitable 15 wins, won by 146 points, beat his teammate by 149 points. Championship wrapped with 4 races to go. One from P14 in Belgium, was leading that race after 12 laps. I could go on and on and on, but Max Verstappen has been scary good this year. His P1 is not moved for me or for you. 9.5 out of 10. It's going to take one hell of a job, not just from another driver, for another team to give their driver a car that can get close to that Red Bull Verstappen package, because right now it's frighteningly good. Not impossible, but it's going to be a tough gig. Nothing else to say. Well done, Max. Big up the 5,782 of you who did the poll and gave me your ratings. What do you think? Who do you agree with more, me or the collective? Tommo versus the people, the biggest case in F1 history. This was fun. Bring on 23. My name's Tommo. Thanks again. Have a good one. Ta-da.